Welcome back to Tom's Datsun Garage. While I, off camera, tracked down replacement hardware for my Project Z, I figured I would release a series of videos outlining my history with Datsuns. And let's start with the very first Datsun encounter for me. My parents' maroon two-door early 1980 Datsun B210 sedan. This was the deluxe model and had a 5-speed manual transmission, as well as the A15 1.5-liter 4-cylinder engine. This car was not equipped with air conditioning, which is probably why my parents didn't keep it for more than maybe 4 years or so. Well, that and the fact that my brother had come along, so with 3 kids, it was a bit of a tight fit inside that B210, especially without AC. One of my earliest memories is my dad changing the oil and filter on that car in the driveway. I can still kind of see him leaning over the fender unscrewing the oil filter. He had the foresight to purchase a factory service manual when he bought the car. He did buy the car brand new, and the service manual, he only referred to it really to get the valve adjustment specifications. I still have this book to this very day, and I was thumbing through it and was finding all kinds of scribbles that I left in the book back when I was a little kid and just didn't know any better. This book pretty much is what started it for me, that car, and thumbing through this book and looking at all the diagrams and pictures and specifications. This is kind of like the very genesis of my Datsun history right here. This car must have left quite an impression on me because I was drawing in the book and scribbling and making pictures of the car. I only have one recreation of one of the pictures that I drew of that car. I drew a picture similar to this back in probably like first grade, and I lost the original, but I drew it again in fourth grade and added maybe a couple more things to it, but this is pretty much what the original one looked like for the most part. But my parents weren't the only ones that had a Datsun. My grandparents also had a Datsun 510. Unfortunately, there are only 3 pictures of this car known to exist, and my grandfather passed away in 1982. And I remember the car being driven by my aunt at the time, and then she went to the Peace Corps for 2 years. So then the car went and sat at my uncle's house for that period of time, and they drove it around occasionally to keep it going. And then when she came back from the Peace Corps, she was driving it around again. The only issue I remember that car having is that the gas gauge didn't work, and she wound up using the trip odometer to figure out how far she went on a tank of gas before she knew she had to refill it. And she wound up selling that car eventually, and I believe it wasn't much longer than that she got her first real new car, which was a brand new 88 or 89 Mitsubishi Mirage. It was white and 5-speed. All of this brings us to today's subject, my 1982 Datsun/Nissan Sentra. This car is a deluxe model, has a 3-speed automatic transmission with lock-up torque converter, and has no AC from the factory. This car was bought brand spanking new by my grandparents in 1982. Unfortunately, this is the earliest picture of the car that I have, and this is in 1986 in the fall, and that's my little brother on his tractor there in front of it. This is a time where my grandmom came up and visited us in Pennsylvania. My grandmom and the car actually lived in Baltimore, Maryland, and this is the next oldest picture I have of the car, which was also taken in 1986 in front of my grandmom's house. These pictures are all in chronological order, by the way, in case you haven't figured that out. This picture here is me when I was 14 years old, and I figured out that I was going to be the one to eventually own the car. Needless to say, I was pretty excited. By this point in time, we were living in South Florida, and we were coming back to Maryland and Pennsylvania to visit, primarily in the summer for about a week or two each time. And when I would come and visit, I would make it a point to wash and wax and polish the car as best I possibly could for my grandmom. And I would clean out the interior and so forth. A lot of her neighbors used to comment, "Hey, leave some paint on that thing, will you?" Or something to the effect of, "Hey, can you do my car next?" Or something like that. Alright, let's fast forward to the winter of 1996. This was around January or February of 96. This was the last winter and snow that my Sentra would see. And summer of 1996, I got the car from my grandmom and drove it home to South Florida. The Sentra sat in the driveway for 6 months until I turned 18, and then I was able to register it and title it and drive it. And this is the earliest picture I have of that car when it came here, and that's my buddy Wes, and we're both checking the battery or something under the hood. And my sister was in art class at the time, and she used black and white film and a fancy camera to take that picture, as well as a couple of other pictures. Being that this was my senior year in high school, some friends of mine had given a group of us guys these little dinosaur-looking things, and they had 2 blue ones and an orange one. And for some reason, I wound up with the only orange one, even though my favorite color was blue. Anyway, I named him Mortis, and he in no way looked like a tortoise, but he was Mortis the tortoise anyway. And I put him in my glove box because the glove box rattles when the car is at idle and in gear. That is just one of its many endearing qualities. I use the Sentra to go from home to school, to work after school, and back home again, cruise around, hang around with my friends, and I even took it to my senior prom, as seen here in this photo. Most of these photos, or pretty much all of them, are from other cameras. But my camera at the time was a 110 film Lee Click camera that I had gotten for Christmas in 1989, I believe it was. So from now on, you'll be seeing what the car looked like through my lens. My first big trip with the Sentra was one where me and a friend drove down to Key West for a weekend. And it was really cool because I had never been on a road trip like that before. And it was a lot of fun. Gary and I rode around in Key West and hung out up and down Duval Street, and I got a picture of the car by the southernmost point marker, which was pretty much the goal of the entire trip for me. I just really wanted a picture of that car near that marker. And I had my friend jump out of the car with my camera and shoot that picture while we were driving past it. So that was a really cool memory that I have from back then, and that was just after I graduated high school, and I would start college in the fall. Having taken me through the rest of high school and all the way through college, the car has performed flawlessly at this point. Just oil changes, and I have put new tires on it. Just basic stuff. The car did really well, never broke down, never stranded me, got great gas mileage the entire time. So in 1999, I was about to be graduating college and starting my career come around the summertime. So around the spring, I took the car apart and I drove it over to a local body shop and had the car body work done and repainted. Now, I did replace both front fenders with aftermarket fenders because it was easier that way at the time. The fenders were cheap. They were like $50 a piece. And because I wasn't going to be paying for another semester of college, I used the money I saved to have this car repainted. I had asked that the car get repainted in its original color, and I believe it's pretty close to the original color, but probably not exact. But after the paint job, I put the car back together. It looked absolutely amazing, and I just loved every bit of it. And I even replicated the pinstripe that was on the car down to the last detail and length, and I put brand new emblems on it just to really help everything pop and look fresh. This was very short-lived because, unfortunately, while I was going to go see my friend up at his work, and then we were going to go watch the South Park movie that had just come out, I was driving through the parking lot at his work during a really crazy summer storm, and it blew one of the gates closed right on top of my hood while I was driving through the parking lot and gouged the paint right down to the primer. And that gouge is actually still there to this day. I did have to have the hood repainted, and they charged me $100 to repaint the hood, which, looking back, was okay and fairly reasonable, but it figures, you go through all that hard work and trouble just to have something like that mess it up. But I had the hood repainted, and that was that. As far back as around 10th or 11th grade, I was daydreaming about how I would make this car eventually look. I had a very specific vision in mind, which included stripes and a number plate. I did wind up using a design that I came up with and had the car's appearance changed by putting vinyl on it exactly how I envisioned it. This, looking back, is, I guess you could say it's kind of cheesy, but it was what I wanted at the time, and that is what I had done, and I was very happy with it. But with the car so nice and so clean and I had so much into it, I couldn't use it as a daily driver anymore. I had a close call coming back from college one night that made me kind of go, I think I should take this off the road before somebody else takes it off the road for me permanently. And I wind up getting another car for a daily driver at around the year 2000. After college, I had used the Sentra to drive back and forth to work, but then I had wind up picking up my next Datsun, which was a 1983 Datsun 200SX, light blue, 5-speed, blue interior, with air conditioning. So the Sentra became like a car that I loved and drove sparingly to help preserve it, and I actually wind up covering it up, and most of the time it sat under a cover in my parents' driveway while I lived at the house there, and I collected my other Datsun, my 200SX, and my other Datsun, a 1973 Datsun 240Z. More on those two later, but with this car sitting in the driveway and me driving the 200SX every day, the Sentra didn't get a whole lot of use and came out on nice days, which is kind of how it should be with a classic car at this point. 2001, I wind up moving into my own house, and the car went straight into the garage then. And I drove the car very sparingly between the years 2000 and around 2010. Very sparingly. The car still had under 100,000 miles on it. And I eventually got to the point where the power steering rack was starting to leak, and I really didn't feel like driving it with a leaky power steering rack and having to top it off, and some of the suspension bushings were not in great shape, so it was time to park the car for a while, and I put it under a cover and I pushed up against the wall, and that's where I had left it, and I started working on my 71 240Z this time. So the entire time I was taking apart my current 240Z, this car was off to the side, under a cover, up out of the way, hanging out until I get a chance to work on it again, which that later became Project Resurrection. The Sentra sat up on dollies, under a cover, off to the side for 2 years, and while my 240Z was away at the body shop, I really couldn't do much with it, and I got a real bad itch for driving around a classic Datsun, and this led me down a rabbit hole of months and months of looking for a Datsun station wagon to buy. But I kind of forgot that I had a classic Datsun right under my nose that could use recommissioning. So in 2016, as seen here, I uncovered the Sentra and began Project Resurrection. I saw all the leaks that it had, I knew about already, moved the car away from the wall, uncovered it, and could see how the vinyl had aged underneath the cover, and how it had yellowed and chipped. I did store things on top of the car while it was sitting there. When I was taking apart my 240Z, I was stacking parts up on it. None of that's ideal, but time hasn't been kind to the vinyl, and so now it was time to recommission my Sentra and peel off all of that stuff that I had put on it that I now find cheesy, and recommission my Sentra. I slowly started peeling off some of the vinyl, and unfortunately some of the paint got peeled off with it. So I had to find ways to repair this by kind of taping off the areas and painting them myself, which didn't turn out that great. But I got all the vinyl off the car, all of the stickers off the car, and I did leave the original the pinstripe that was on it, because that's the way it was when my grandfather bought it. And you can see where the sun had faded the paint, where the vinyl stickers weren't. So I always found that kind of interesting. But I was also going over the car and making a list of items that need to be addressed while I was taking all of this stuff off of the car, or undoing past sins, so to speak. One of the things that kept me from redoing this Sentra was I thought it was going to be prohibitively expensive. And the more research I was doing, I actually found myself on Rock Auto's website, and I was like, I can really get parts for very reasonable prices for this car. So it became more and more of a reality that, hey, I can actually fix my Sentra back up to tip-top condition and drive it around again to kind of help ease the pain of not having a Datsun to drive around in. So I ordered an absolute ton of parts from Rock Auto, put the car up on jack stands, and got to work in short order. First thing I wanted to do was pull the transmission out, because I knew that it had needed resealing, and I wanted to replace the steering rack. So I got a hold of my service manual and went to work. And now, as you all can no doubt tell, my pictures are all way nicer than they were earlier. And now we were in the age of the iPhone, so from here on the pictures are much better, and I actually have some video as well. But I pulled the transmission pan out and just basically did a good inspection on everything on the car as it came apart. I was absolutely not worried or scared about taking this car apart. I'm very familiar with it. This car has been a part of my life since it was brand new in some shape or form, whether it was my grandmom's car and I'd ride around in it with her to go to church or whatever, or when it became my car and I would learn about it by reading service manuals and just basically doing basic maintenance on the car and just studying it, really. So nothing, it was basically zero fear. I took everything apart in a methodical way, and I didn't really see the need to label anything, but it wound up not being a big problem. It's a very simple car, relatively. So I got the transmission out of the way. I saw that I needed to do some resealing with the front pump seal, which is what I thought was leaking on the car. The oil pan reseal, I basically resealed the engine while it was in the car. I never took the engine out. I did reseal the oil pan. Rear main seal was replaced. Basically, I was going through and doing all gaskets, all seals, redoing the CV axles and boots. The driver's CV axle, as seen here, is actually the original one to the car. It's never been replaced. The passenger side CV axle I replaced once with one from Advanced Auto Parts, back when it was called Discount Auto Parts. Back in, it must have been high school, I think I replaced it because the boot was open. I also redid the wheel bearings. I did damage them, as you see here, when I put them together the last time I did the brakes and wheel bearings. So I was undoing those sins by replacing the rotors and bearings this time, but with using proper tools and methods, using high temp grease. And then, of course, while everything was apart, I was painting everything. a nice gloss black or flat black or whatever color I felt it really should be. And the stuff turned out looking really good. And I got all these sub-assemblies together that looked really nice. And then, of course, the sum of everything once it's put back on the car looks absolutely amazing. I had degreased and wire brushed the outside of the transmission case before splitting it. And then I replaced the case gasketing and all the outside seals, the axle shaft seals, and I even replaced the accumulator O-rings behind this cover here. Once I got the transmission all put back together, I went ahead and coated everything with a bright silver paint just to help it look a little nice, like very clean aluminum. That was actually the name of the color of the paint, although it looked, I don't know, maybe it looks a little cheesy or bright, but that's the color it is, and it turned out fine in my eyes, I guess. Looks better than grungy old aluminum. And while the transmission was out, it was a real easy time to replace the power steering rack. So I went ahead and did so and replaced the power steering return hose. And any of the hoses that I could replace were replaced. I also replaced the outer tie rod ends. And then after the steering was done, I moved to the heater hoses. And I replaced the heater hoses that were on the firewall that were original. Not that they were leaking, but just in case. I also put a brand spanking new fuel pump and fuel lines on the car. I went through the fuel system, blocked off the fuel tank with a garbage bag to seal it off, and used air, compressed air, to pressurize the tank and blow the old fuel into a jug to get rid of it. This method worked really well to clear the tank. Once all the lines were clear, I replaced all the fuel hoses with new ones, and of course the fuel pump and the fuel pump spacer gaskets, just to make sure the fuel system was 100% because the car had sat for quite a while. I hooked it up to everything to the carburetor. The carburetor really didn't stand out as having an issue or anything at this time, so I didn't bother messing with the carburetor. It always ran great. Now it was time to finally get everything put back together on the back side of the engine to get the transmission in place. And while I did this, I went together with brand new motor mounts, so all the motor mounts were replaced. A lot of the vacuum hoses are still original and still in excellent shape, so I didn't bother messing with them at all. But here's one of the rear motor mounts right here, brand new as you can see. Another one of the dog bone mounts right here in the front, that's brand new. Got everything put back together, and I was able to have my buddy Dave help for a bit. He was a big help during this period of time. He also helped build the dolly for my 240Z. So big shout out to Dave for helping me on my cars. I got my heater hoses put back together in the radiator and the front of the engine. Got the battery back in, the battery tray. Got everything put back together. Started putting the suspension back together, the steering knuckles, all the tie rod ends, put those in, and while I was here, I decided it was probably best if I went ahead and repainted the sway bar, because being yellow just wasn't going to cut it anymore. So I painted it in its original color black, put it back under the car, and painted my brake calipers so that they wouldn't rust or corrode. So everything that I took off, I had cleaned, replaced, painted, and put back on, and would look, so everything just looks nice and crisp and clear. Because I was there anyway, and you might as well. The rear brakes were completely wasted. I knew that the rear wheel cylinders were starting to leak the last time I drove the car, so it was a good time to go ahead and take care of that. New drums, new wheel cylinders, new brake shoes and hardware. Made sure everything was adjusted correctly and put it back together. Now it was time for the valve seals. This was something that I was kind of avoiding because I didn't want to use air pressure. So I figured out if I used some rope, I can stuff it down into the cylinders and then push the piston up against the rope, which would hold the valves closed, so I can get the springs off with this nifty factory valve spring tool that I had borrowed from work. I went ahead and took apart everything, used this nifty tool, and started replacing the valve seals. one by one. I went right on down, and when I took off the old valve seals, they were so hard and dry that it is visible how they stayed open. So compared to the new one, you can see the new one on the right is way more closed up. So I replaced all the valve seals, lubed everything, adjusted all the valve lash, per the specifications in the book for the cold valve lash settings, because it gives them cold or hot. Then I covered up the top of the motor with the valve cover and moved on to the front of the engine. I replaced the timing belt, the tensioner. I replaced the cam seals, the jack shaft seal, the crank seal. I replaced the front engine the back timing cover gaskets, the water pump, pretty much everything that you would replace during an engine reseal was replaced. I didn't ever pull the head off the engine. I never had a reason to do that, so I never pulled the head off. But pretty much everything else got replaced except for the intake gasket, the exhaust manifold gasket, and the head gasket. I put all new belts on. I got everything put back together underneath, drove the car to work for a shakedown, discovered that there was still some kind of leaks. The axle seal wound up leaking on the passenger front, but everything else looked relatively decent. I had to put new tires on the car anyway, so I repainted the wheels and put white wall tires on it, just like my grandparents had on the car when it was new. So I was returning this car to more of a how it was in appearance when my grandmom had it, with the exception, of course, of the tinted windows. I wanted everything else to look pretty much like as it was. After its first shakedown run, I was pretty thrilled with it, and it was time to move on to undoing some of my more recent sins, which was when I peeled some of the paint off. So I taped off sections of the door and used some very old touch-up paint that I had laying around and did my best at trying to cover up the missing paint spots. The paint match itself, while not perfect, is pretty decent, and if you step back from the car or it drives past you, you may not even notice these spots. Most people, surprisingly enough, today don't even see this until I point it out to them. Of course, I'm going to know it's there. I know every square inch of this car, upside down, inside out, every bit of it. I've had the interior out, I've had, you name it. I've just been all the way through this car, as you should, especially since I've owned it since summer of 1996. But at any rate, I got all that chipped off paint and flaked off paint done, and I was happy with the results for the most part. So then it was time to undo my sins from the interior by removing the steering wheel cover that I had sewed on in high school, remove the tape deck. I also removed the clock that I had put in from a 85 or 86 model Sentra that I had gotten from the junkyard one time, and installed the original radio and faceplate with change tray. Now the radio didn't work when I put it in. It had been out of the car since 97 or so. So I wind up cleaning the contacts inside the radio and put it all back together, put it back in the car, and voila, I got sound. And it seems to hold stations just like it used to, no problem at all. And the lights all inside work. The little bar above the FM means it's coming through in stereo. So I was very pleased to have this radio working exactly like it used to back when my grandmom had the car. With the radio put back in and working, only the front two speakers are used in the factory system. So I removed the rear parcel shelf and the rear speakers that I had put in at the same time I put the tape deck in to have 4 speakers and stereo. So I put the original rear deck cover back in, parcel shelf cover back in, and then installed brand new wiper blades, factory Nissan wiper blades. I did hear some noises while I was driving the car and didn't think much of it, and I thought maybe it was a noise coming from the crankshaft bearings from all the dry starts over the years of it sitting long periods of time in between use. Turns out that the bearings weren't really worn super bad, and when I measured all the crankshaft clearances, everything was in spec. So I put in brand new bearing shells, and then I could still hear a noise like you hear now coming through. As it turns out, when I replaced my timing belt, when I had the engine apart, I put it back together incorrectly in quite a boneheaded move. There is a flat washer with a curve on it that helps guide the belt along its way, and I had it on the wrong side of the lower crank pulley, so it was causing things to not line up right and sit flush, and a rocking back and forth was taking place, causing that ticking noise, and the belt was riding against the timing cover that period of time as well. So I had to clean out all the rubber dust, get another timing belt, get that washer where it belongs, and put it back together, and then everything was fine. Now, the muffler was next, and I ordered a correct muffler for the car and had it welded on by a local muffler shop, so that put the car back to its normal, quiet self. The other problem I was finding with my shakedown runs was the leak that I had mentioned earlier. I didn't know if this was excessive movement in the CV axle area where it connects to the transmission or not, but I might have damaged the seal going back together. I wasn't really sure what was going on here, but I did wind up replacing the seal again, and that did fix this leak. Also, at the same time, I wind up replacing the sway bar mounting bushings as well as the sway bar end link bushings as seen here. Another issue that wound up popping up was that the aftermarket replacement radiator that I had put in during the recommissioning process had a small leak around the top tank area. It had a bad solder. So I had also had a leak by the switch for the cooling fan in the bottom of the radiator. That wound up being fixed later, but the Bernzomatic torch and the solder came out, and I tried my hand at repairing the radiator's top tank. I was able to fix this leak myself, and I was actually fairly pleased with the results. And then after I had done all the solder work, I went ahead and hit it with a quick coat of gloss black paint to help everything blend back in to where it looked like I didn't really mess with it too much. I was fairly pleased with the results on this, and the radiator wound up working good for a while. At least good enough for me to take it out for its first outing and showing at a car show. It was a beautiful day, and why not? I had the car running great. Everything was great until New Year's Day, 2017, when the float got stuck in my carburetor and the carburetor wouldn't fill with gas and the car wouldn't go. So I wind up having the car towed back to my house until I could figure out what to do with it. Naturally, I thought, well, I'll just rebuild my carburetor because it's never been touched or messed with, and I never had cause to rebuild it until this point because it had run perfectly fine. So I took the carburetor off and very carefully marked and took lots of pictures of how it came apart. I wanted to make sure that this relatively complex carburetor went back together exactly as it came apart. Of course, with the exception of me actually cleaning it up really, really good and putting new gaskets and what I thought would be new jets in it as well, just to make sure everything was free and clear. I taped off things, marked things, just tried to be so careful taking this carburetor apart, making note of things. I had the factory service manual out just to help make sure I'm doing everything absolutely right. I got a new base plate gasket for the manifold for when it went back together. And it took a while to disassemble the carburetor, but I got to a certain point where the jets were actually frozen in the body of the carburetor. I could not remove the jets, and I wind up damaging the jets. So I took it apart the best I could. I tried to find replacement jets during this time, and I just could not find any jets at all for this carburetor. So I was kind of stuck with a carburetor that was disassembled, jets that are frozen in the body of it that I can't figure out how to remove without really damaging stuff. So I did the best that I could, took the parts, bought a pail of carburetor parts cleaner that has a little bucket inside of it, and I absolutely dunked everything in and soaked all of these parts in it, to make sure everything was as clean and as nice as possible, uh, including the choking mechanism, that kind of stuff. I, I was searching for the jets during this time, couldn't find any of them. No emulsion tubes, nothing. So I just kind of cleaned everything, put everything in a box, and bought a remanufactured carburetor. Turns out there's a place that was offering a remanufactured carburetor. It was the exact model and everything for my car, and they offered a lifetime warranty on it, so I just put that on. And the carburetor made the car run absolutely great. I did some minor adjustments to the idle speed, and the car runs absolutely spot on perfect every time, just like it used to, except with a freshly rebuilt carburetor with a lifetime warranty. Although my joy was short lived, as the shelf in my garage wound up collapsing and dumping a bunch of stuff against the side of my car, damaging my Sentra once again. So I had gotten a dashboard for my 240Z, and all the 240Z parts I had stashed up on the shelf fall against the car. It damaged it, it scratched it, it dented it in places, it damaged trim pieces that are no longer available that I had replaced when I had the car repainted. So I had to go around the car and touch up any of the scratches with that same paint that I had used earlier to try to minimize the damage as best as I possibly could. It seems like I just can't catch a break with this car at times, so I figured now would be a good time to teach myself how to take dents out. So I had bought a PDR kit off of eBay, and I tried my hand at learning PDR, paintless dent removal. I'm not good at it. I used this car as my test. I tried the best I could. I would go out here into the garage at night and play around for an hour or two at a time, trying to get dents out. And I don't know if I really made it worse, but I don't think I did it any favors either. Even in my hood area where the paint was chipped off in areas, I had tried removing dents in the hood. It wound up making it look like I had a bunch of outside or dents that popped up instead of, the regular dents that were in. So I don't think I did it a ton of favors, but I did the best I could. At this point, having gone through the car mechanically pretty much all the way, the only thing that I haven't messed with was the suspension bushings. I had been avoiding them for a very long time because I knew that this car was from up north and they could be very difficult to remove, if at all. So I finally decided to tackle this, and I went ahead and burned the old bushings out and cut the sleeves with a hacksaw, and I bought a press from Harbor Freight so that I could press new bushings into the control arms. I started by doing the front lower control arm bushings first because they were the worst. They were dry rotted and split, but this process wound up being not very fun, but not as hard as I had thought it was going to be. Once I got the front end done, I turned my attention to the back. I got the lower control arms out of there. And what's interesting about the back lower control arms is that the bushings that I pressed in are updated bushings, and it actually fixed a problem that the car has always had, which was a vibration around 60 miles an hour. There was actually a factory TSB that talked about it and pressing in new bushings, but my grandmom never really drove the car on the highway or anything that much, so she probably never even noticed it. But that has always been an issue with that car, and replacing these bushings was like the last thing that I had to do mechanically to the car, and it fixed that problem. So now the car drives so amazing. It tracks true and straight. I'm just so pleased with it. Now, I had been driving the car a couple of years at this point. Pretty much been driving it around since 2016. And the tailpipe piece, the only part of the exhaust that hasn't really been replaced, rotted through, so I kind of rigged it together to get it to a muffler shop, and they cut the rusted section out behind the muffler to the catalytic converter and put in a brand new section of pipe. So this here is the last section of exhaust that needed replaced. I do have an issue with my proportioning valve. It currently has like a fuzzy look to it, like it's starting to leak, but I can't seem to find one anywhere. But I mean, this is all to be expected. The car finally did roll over to the big 100,000 mile mark. By this point in time, all the teething issues from recommissioning the car have been sussed out. I did have to replace the radiator one last time, as my fix didn't really hold for that long period of time. But here it is as it sits today. I take it out on nice sunny days and drive it. I drive it to work on nice sunny days. I usually get to drive it around the most in the wintertime here in South Florida when it's not raining and not 1,000 degrees, because the car still doesn't have air conditioning. I normally keep the car inside the garage under a cover at all times because I don't want it to be out in the weather, because it doesn't need any help rusting, because it's an 82 Sentra. But when I do have to have the car outside, like when I'm working on Project Z and need the extra room in the garage, I have a special heavy-duty waterproof outdoor car cover and tire and wheel covers that I put on the car and strap down really well to keep the car out of the weather as absolutely the best I possibly can. But the car is since back inside the garage because Project Z is at a standstill until further notice. The Sentra runs and drives beautifully today. It makes all the right sounds and smells and feels that it's supposed to. And this car is an absolute time machine. Every single time I get behind the wheel, I am instantly transported back to the 80s and the 90s and the early 2000s when I used to drive this car daily or ride in it with my grandma or whatever. It's just an amazing thing, and I can't imagine what my life would be like without this car in it in some shape or form. I even like to bring the car out for the holidays because it's kind of my way of having my grandma with us during the holidays. Nice, sunny, cool days like Christmas Day or something like that, looking out the window, seeing this car across the street, really makes me feel like my grandma is still around. But this is actually the short version of this video. I really do apologize for the length of it, and I am so grateful for all of you who have stuck through to the very end. If you do want to see more on this car, please leave a comment below. I've left out so many stories and anecdotes that I have over the years in this car because I've owned it the longest. But thanks for sticking by and watching, and I hope it was entertaining to some degree, and maybe if nothing else you learned on how to recondition a 1982 Nissan Sentra. I'm going to make my next video on my 1983 Datsun 200SX, which is the car I used to replace this one as my daily driver. And I'll follow that one up with my 1973 Datsun 240Z. Those videos are going to be a lot shorter than this one because obviously I've owned this car the longest. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.